We live in a world that celebrates achievement louder than fulfillment. We applaud promotions, profits, titles, and followers. We measure our lives by what we accumulate, not by what we contribute. And yet, quietly, beneath the applause, so many people feel exhausted, disconnected, and empty. They did everything they were told would lead to success and still feel like something is missing. That discomfort is not weakness. It is a signal. It is the human response to a life, a career, or a system that knows what it does and how it does it, but has forgotten why. Success without meaning is still failure. Because progress without purpose does not move us forward. It simply moves us faster in the wrong direction. Burnout is not the result of too much work. It is the result of work without meaning. Disconnection is not caused by technology alone. It is caused by cultures that value performance over people. Inequality does not emerge by accident. It grows inside systems designed to extract value rather than serve human beings. When leaders obsess over short-term results, when organizations chase metrics without morals, when societies prioritize growth without direction, people become tools instead of participants. And tools eventually break. Human beings are not motivated by numbers. We are inspired by purpose. We do not give our best to what pays us the most. We give our best to what makes us feel alive, valued, and part of something bigger than ourselves. This is not idealism. This is biology. When people feel safe, trusted, and connected to a cause, they cooperate, they innovate, they endure hardship. But when fear becomes the primary management strategy, fear of losing a job, fear of missing a target, fear of being replaced, trust collapses. And without trust, no organization, no community, no nation can remain strong for long. Fear-based leadership may deliver quick wins, but it guarantees long-term decay. It creates compliance, not commitment. It produces numbers, not loyalty. Leaders who prioritize results over people may look effective in the short run, but they quietly weaken the very systems they depend on. Because the true measure of leadership is not how much power you accumulate, but how many people grow because of you. Purpose-driven leadership begins with a simple but difficult question. Why do we exist beyond making money, beyond winning, beyond surviving? When that question is clear, decisions change, priorities change, behavior changes. Purpose becomes the filter through which we choose what to do and, just as importantly, what not to do. It shifts leadership from control to service, from ego to responsibility, from extraction to contribution. This is not about being soft. Empathy is not weakness. Trust is not a luxury. Long-term thinking is not naive. They are strategic advantages. Organizations that put people first do not do so at the expense of performance. They outperform precisely because people feel seen, protected, and inspired. When individuals believe their work matters, they do not need to be micromanaged. When teams trust their leaders, they do not fear change. When communities share a clear why, resilience becomes possible even in uncertainty. The crisis we face today is not a lack of intelligence or resources. It is a crisis of meaning. We have optimized systems for efficiency, but neglected humanity. We have taught people how to compete, but forgotten how to care. We have rewarded speed while ignoring direction. And the cost is visible everywhere: in mental health struggles, in broken institutions, in leaders who climb higher while feeling increasingly alone at the top. But meaning is not lost forever. It is not something we invent. It is something we remember. Every individual has a why reason they get up in the morning beyond survival. Every organization, at its founding, began with a belief, a cause, a vision of a better future. Over time, pressure, fear, and convenience can obscure that belief. The work now is to rediscover it, to articulate it clearly, and to align our actions with it consistently, especially when it is difficult. This is where responsibility begins, not with grand speeches or viral slogans, but with everyday choices. Leaders choosing to protect their people before protecting their numbers. Individuals choosing to work for meaning, not just money. Communities choosing cooperation over division. Progress happens when enough people decide that success must include dignity, trust, and service. The future does not belong to the most aggressive or the most efficient. It belongs to those who think long-term, who build cultures of trust, and who understand that leadership is not about being in charge. It is about taking care of those in your charge. When we lead with purpose, we do more than succeed. We create conditions where others can succeed too. So the call to action is simple, but it is not easy. Ask yourself why you do what you do. Demand that your organization stand for something beyond profit. Refuse to measure your life solely by external rewards. Choose to build, to lead, and to contribute in ways that will still matter years from now, even when no one is watching. Because in the end, success is not what we achieve for ourselves. It is what we help others become. And a life, a business, or a society that forgets its why may look successful on the outside, but inside, it is already failing. Success without purpose leads to burnout, not fulfillment, because human beings are not designed to run endlessly on achievement alone. We can chase goals, hit targets, and accumulate rewards, but if there is no deeper reason behind the effort, the energy that fuels us eventually runs out. Purpose is what gives meaning to strain, pressure, and sacrifice. Without it, even the most impressive success feels hollow. People often mistake exhaustion for weakness, when in reality, it is the body and mind signaling a lack of alignment between what we do and why we do it. Burnout is not a failure of capacity, it is a failure of meaning. When individuals pursue success solely defined by external validation, money, titles, recognition, status, they become trapped in a cycle that never truly satisfies. Each achievement provides a brief emotional high, followed by a need for the next win. The bar keeps moving, but fulfillment never arrives. This is because success measured only by outcomes ignores the human need for connection, contribution, and belief. Work becomes transactional instead of personal. Effort turns into obligation rather than choice. Over time, motivation fades, cynicism grows, and passion is replaced by survival mode. Purpose changes the experience of hard work. When people understand why their effort matters beyond themselves, stress becomes more tolerable, and setbacks become meaningful rather than defeating. Purpose acts as a stabilizer in uncertainty. It gives context to sacrifice and transforms pressure into a form of service. Without purpose, pressure feels arbitrary. People begin to ask themselves why they are pushing so hard if the result is only more pressure tomorrow. This is where burnout takes hold quietly and persistently. Modern systems often accelerate this problem. Organizations reward performance without nurturing belief. Leaders focus on quarterly results while neglecting long-term human sustainability. Employees are praised for output but rarely reminded of impact. In such environments, people feel replaceable rather than valued. When leaders fail to articulate a clear reason for the work beyond profit or efficiency, individuals are left to manufacture their own meaning, which is difficult to sustain alone. The result is disengagement disguised as productivity. Burnout thrives in cultures where people are seen as resources instead of humans. Long hours, constant urgency, and fear-based incentives may produce results in the short term, but they slowly erode trust and well-being. People stop caring not because they are lazy, but because caring feels unsafe or pointless. Fulfillment cannot exist where people feel invisible. Purpose is the antidote, because it reconnects individuals to the human value of their contribution. It reminds them that their efforts serve something larger than personal gain or managerial approval. On a personal level, success without purpose creates identity confusion. When people define themselves solely by what they achieve, failure becomes devastating and rest feels undeserved. There is no internal anchor, only external metrics. This leads to anxiety, perfectionism, and emotional exhaustion. Purpose provides that anchor. It allows people to see success as a tool rather than an identity. It creates space for balance, reflection, and resilience. Without it, people push themselves until something breaks. Fulfillment does not come from doing more. It comes from doing what matters. People who are fulfilled are not necessarily less busy or less ambitious. They are aligned. Their effort is directed by belief rather than fear. They know why they say yes and why they say no. This clarity protects them from burnout because their energy is spent intentionally. Even when work is demanding, it feels worthwhile rather than draining. Purpose also reframes how we experience success. Instead of asking what we achieved, we begin to ask who we helped, what we learned, and what we contributed. This shift changes motivation from extraction to service. It reduces burnout because fulfillment comes from impact, not applause. Applause fades quickly. Impact endures. When success is pursued without purpose, people may look accomplished from the outside while feeling empty on the inside. They keep going not because they are inspired, but because stopping would force them to confront the emptiness. Purpose interrupts that cycle. It invites honesty. It asks harder questions that lead to healthier answers. Burnout is not solved by vacations, bonuses, or motivational slogans. It is solved by reconnecting people to a reason that makes effort meaningful. Fulfillment is not the absence of stress or difficulty. It is the presence of meaning. Purpose does not eliminate burnout by making work easy. It prevents burnout by making work worth it. People are inspired by why, not driven by metrics alone. Because numbers can measure performance, but they cannot ignite belief. Metrics tell us what happened, but they do not tell us why it matters. Human beings do not wake up in the morning energized by dashboards, targets, or spreadsheets. They are energized by a sense of purpose, by the belief that their effort contributes to something meaningful. When organizations rely exclusively on metrics to motivate behavior, they reduce human potential to mechanical output and inspiration quietly disappears. Metrics are necessary. They provide clarity, accountability, and direction, but they are not sufficient. When numbers become the primary language of leadership, people begin to optimize for scores rather than values. They do what is measured, not what is right. Over time, this creates cultures of compliance instead of commitment. People hit targets while losing trust, creativity, and care. The organization may appear successful on paper while slowly eroding from within. Inspiration comes from belief, not pressure. A clear why gives people context for the metrics they are asked to achieve. It explains why the work matters beyond personal reward or punishment. When people understand the purpose behind the numbers, they engage emotionally as well as intellectually. This emotional engagement is what sustains effort during uncertainty, stress, and change. Metrics can push people to act, but only purpose pulls them forward willingly. In environments where metrics dominate without meaning, fear becomes the motivator. Fear of missing a target. Fear of losing status. Fear of being replaced. Fear can produce short-term performance, but it cannot produce loyalty or innovation. People become cautious, risk-averse, and self-protective. They stop thinking long-term because survival feels more urgent than contribution. This is why organizations obsessed with numbers often struggle with trust and collaboration. A strong why creates alignment. It allows individuals to make decisions without waiting for instructions because they understand the underlying intent. This reduces dependence on control and increases ownership. When people know why their work exists, they can adapt intelligently rather than follow rules blindly. Metrics then become tools for learning, not weapons for punishment. They inform progress instead of defining worth. Inspiration also changes how people interpret success and failure. When driven solely by metrics, failure feels personal and threatening. When guided by purpose, failure becomes feedback in service of a larger goal. People are more willing to experiment, speak up, and challenge assumptions because they feel protected by shared belief. This psychological safety is impossible to measure directly, yet it is one of the strongest predictors of long-term performance. On an individual level, metrics without why create anxiety and exhaustion. People begin to chase numbers without understanding how those numbers connect to impact. They work harder, but feel less fulfilled. This disconnect leads to disengagement, even among high performers. Purpose restores meaning by linking effort to contribution. It reminds people that their work serves others, not just systems. Leaders play a critical role in this balance. When leaders communicate only what needs to be achieved, they manage tasks. When they communicate why it matters, they lead people. Leadership is not about controlling outcomes. It is about creating conditions where people want to give their best. Metrics can be copied. Purpose cannot. That is why organizations with a clear why are more resilient in times of crisis. When numbers fall, belief remains. And belief is what carries people through uncertainty. Society reflects the same pattern. When progress is measured only by economic indicators, human well-being suffers. Growth without meaning leads to inequality, disconnection, and mistrust. Metrics may show improvement while people feel worse. A shared why at the societal level creates cohesion. It gives people a reason to cooperate, sacrifice, and care beyond individual gain. People do not resist metrics because they are lazy or undisciplined. They resist them because metrics alone do not speak to the human need for purpose. Inspiration comes from knowing that what we do matters, that our effort contributes to something beyond ourselves, and that we are part of a cause rather than a machine. Metrics can guide behavior, but why is what gives behavior meaning. Without why, numbers become empty goals. With why, numbers become milestones on a meaningful journey. Fear-based leadership delivers short-term results but long-term damage because fear is a powerful accelerator, not a sustainable fuel. When people are afraid of punishment, loss, or humiliation, they act quickly. They comply. They meet deadlines. They follow orders. On the surface, this can look like effective leadership. Targets are hit, urgency is high, and control feels tight. But fear does not build commitment, trust, or resilience. It builds silence, anxiety, and fragility. And over time, those hidden costs undermine everything fear initially appears to produce. Fear narrows thinking. When people operate under constant pressure, their primary goal becomes self-protection rather than contribution. They focus on avoiding mistakes instead of creating value. Innovation slows because risk feels dangerous. Honest feedback disappears because speaking up feels unsafe. Problems are hidden until they become crises. In fear-based environments, people do not bring their full intelligence to work. They bring only what is necessary to survive. Short-term gains under fear are often the result of overexertion. People work longer hours, push past healthy limits, and sacrifice well-being to meet expectations. Leaders may interpret this as dedication, but it is often desperation. Over time, exhaustion accumulates. Burnout rises. Turnover increases. The organization loses not just people, but institutional knowledge, relationships, and continuity. The system becomes weaker even as leaders demand more from those who remain. Fear also erodes trust, which is the foundation of any strong organization or society. When leaders use fear to motivate, they signal that people are valued only for their output. This transactional relationship discourages loyalty. People stop identifying with the mission and start calculating their own risk. Trust cannot coexist with fear because trust requires safety, and fear removes safety by design. In fear-driven cultures, metrics become weapons rather than tools. Numbers are used to threaten rather than to learn. Performance reviews feel like interrogations instead of conversations. This creates a zero-sum mindset where individuals compete rather than collaborate. Teamwork suffers because helping others feels risky when everyone is judged individually. The organization fragments into silos, each protecting itself from blame. Leadership built on fear also damages decision-making at the top. When leaders surround themselves with people who are afraid, they receive filtered information. Bad news is delayed or softened. Leaders begin to believe their own narrative of success because dissent is absent. This false confidence leads to poor strategic choices, as reality is no longer visible until it is too late. The long-term societal impact of fear-based leadership is equally severe. Systems built on fear normalize inequality and abuse of power. They reward obedience over integrity and silence over courage. Over time, people disengage from institutions they do not trust. Cynicism replaces belief. Cooperation gives way to polarization. Stability erodes, even if order appears to be maintained. Fear is often justified as necessary in competitive or high-pressure environments, but pressure does not require fear. High standards do not require intimidation. Discipline does not require humiliation. The most resilient systems in nature and in human organizations are built on cooperation, not coercion. They endure because participants are connected by shared purpose, not held together by threat. Leadership that replaces fear with trust does not eliminate accountability, it strengthens it. When people feel safe, they take responsibility, they admit mistakes early, they ask for help, they invest emotionally in outcomes. This creates systems that can adapt, learn, and recover. Trust-based leadership may feel slower at first, but it compounds over time while fear creates diminishing returns. Fear-based leaders often believe they are being strong, but strength in leadership is not the ability to control others. It is the ability to create environments where people can perform at their best without sacrificing their humanity. Control can force action, but it cannot inspire belief. Without belief, any success achieved is temporary. Long-term strength requires leaders who understand that people are not resources to be squeezed, but partners to be supported. When leadership is grounded in empathy, clarity, and purpose, people do not need to be scared into performing. They choose to contribute because they trust the system and believe in what it stands for. Fear may deliver results today, but it quietly destroys the capacity for tomorrow. Trust and empathy are strategic advantages, not soft values, because they directly influence performance, resilience, and long-term success. In complex systems where uncertainty is constant and change is inevitable, no amount of rules, controls, or incentives can replace human judgment and cooperation. Trust enables speed with chaos. Empathy enables decisions that account for real human behavior rather than theoretical models. Together, they form the foundation of organizations and societies that can adapt and endure. When trust is present, friction decreases. People do not waste energy protecting themselves, second-guessing intentions, or navigating internal politics. Information flows more freely because individuals believe it is safe to be honest. Decisions are made faster because less time is spent on approval layers and defensive documentation. This operational efficiency is not accidental, it is the direct result of psychological safety. Trust removes the invisible tax that fear places on every interaction. Empathy strengthens strategy by grounding it in reality. Leaders who understand the experiences, pressures, and motivations of the people they lead make better decisions. They anticipate consequences beyond spreadsheets. They recognize that morale, burnout, and disengagement are not abstract concepts but predictable outcomes of certain behaviors. Empathy allows leaders to design systems that work with human nature rather than against it, which reduces resistance and increases adoption of change. Organizations that dismiss trust and empathy as soft often compensate with control. More rules, more monitoring, more incentives, more penalties. This creates complexity and cost without addressing root causes. Control-based systems assume people must be managed because they cannot be trusted. Trust-based systems assume people want to do good work if the conditions are right. The latter consistently outperforms the former over time because it scales human potential instead of restricting it. Trust also amplifies accountability. In low-trust environments, accountability feels threatening. People hide mistakes and shift blame. In high-trust environments, accountability feels shared. People take ownership because they know errors will be met with problem-solving rather than punishment. This accelerates learning and prevents small issues from becoming systemic failures. Trust does not remove consequences. It ensures consequences lead to improvement rather than fear. Empathy plays a critical role in leadership credibility. People do not follow titles. They follow leaders who demonstrate understanding. When individuals feel seen and heard, they are more willing to commit discretionary effort. This is effort that cannot be demanded or measured, yet it is the difference between average performance and excellence. Empathy unlocks this effort by signaling respect and care, which strengthens loyalty and engagement. In times of crisis, trust and empathy became even more valuable. When uncertainty rises, people look to leadership for stability. Leaders who have invested in trust before a crisis can mobilize faster because people believe in their intentions. Communication is accepted rather than questioned. Sacrifices are shared rather than resisted. Organizations without trust struggle to respond because every decision is met with skepticism. At a societal level, trust and empathy are prerequisites for cooperation. Economies, institutions, and communities depend on shared belief that systems are fair and that people will act in good faith. When trust erodes, transaction costs rise, polarization increases, and progress slows. Empathy counteracts division by humanizing perspectives and reducing zero-sum thinking. It creates space for dialogue rather than conflict. Calling trust and empathy soft misunderstands their function. Soft suggests optional, secondary, or decorative. In reality, they are structural. They shape behavior at scale. They influence how information moves, how decisions are made, and how people respond under pressure. They determine whether systems grow stronger or weaker over time. Leaders who prioritize trust and empathy are not avoiding hard decisions. They are making smarter ones. They understand that performance is a human outcome, not a mechanical one. By investing in relationships, clarity, and care, they build organizations that can sustain excellence without sacrificing well-being. Trust and empathy are not sentimental ideals. They are practical tools for building durable success. In an unpredictable world, true leadership is service to something bigger than oneself, because leadership is not about elevation, it is about responsibility. When leadership becomes a means of self-advancement, power concentrates and purpose erodes. Titles grow, authority expands, but impact shrinks. Leadership that serves only the individual inevitably disconnects from the people it is meant to guide. And when that disconnection happens, trust weakens and systems begin to fail. Service is what anchors leadership beyond ego, ambition, and personal gain. Human beings instinctively respond to leaders who demonstrate that the mission matters more than their own status. When leaders place themselves at the center, decisions become distorted. Choices are made to protect reputation rather than people, to preserve control rather than progress. Over time, organizations shaped by self-serving leadership lose credibility because people sense misalignment between words and intent. Service corrects this distortion by shifting the leader's role from hero to steward. Leadership rooted in service begins with humility. Humility is not the absence of confidence. It is the clarity that leadership exists to enable others to succeed. Servant leaders ask different questions. They ask how their decisions affect the least powerful, not just the most influential. They ask what will strengthen the system long after they are gone, not what will make them look successful today. This mindset naturally encourages long-term thinking because service requires continuity, not quick wins. When leaders serve something bigger than themselves, they create cultures of contribution rather than competition. People stop fighting for visibility and start working towards shared outcomes. Recognition becomes collective rather than individual. This alignment reduces internal friction and increases cooperation. Individuals feel part of a cause rather than subordinate to a personality. That sense of belonging fuels motivation that no incentive structure can replicate. Service-oriented leadership also strengthens ethical decision-making. When leaders view their role as service, they are less likely to compromise values for convenience. Shortcuts become harder to justify because the consequences affect people, not just numbers. Integrity becomes a practical necessity rather than a moral accessory. This consistency builds trust, which compounds over time into credibility and influence. In contrast, leadership driven by self-interest creates fragility. When people believe decisions are made for personal benefit, commitment erodes, loyalty becomes conditional, effort becomes minimal. Even high performers disengage emotionally because they do not see their work contributing to anything meaningful. The organization may still function, but it lacks soul, resilience, and depth. Service does not mean self-sacrifice to the point of burnout. It means alignment with a cause that gives effort meaning. Leaders who serve a larger purpose are often more energized, not less, because their work is anchored in belief. They are willing to endure criticism, uncertainty, and hardship because their identity is not tied to approval, but to impact. At a societal level, leadership as service is essential for trust in institutions. When citizens perceive leaders as servants of the common good rather than beneficiaries of power, cooperation increases. People are more willing to contribute, comply, and sacrifice because they believe the system is fair. Without this belief, systems rely increasingly on force and control, which accelerates decline. Service-centered leadership also creates succession strength. Leaders who serve the mission rather than themselves invest in developing others. They build leaders, not followers. This ensures continuity and adaptability. The measure of such leadership is not how indispensable the leader appears, but how capable the system remains without them. True leadership is not defined by how many people report to you, but by how many people are better because of you. It is not measured by authority, but by responsibility willingly accepted. When leaders commit to serving something bigger than themselves, they transform leadership from a position into a practice, from control into care, and from ambition into legacy. True leadership is service to something bigger than oneself, because leadership, at its core, is not about elevation or entitlement, but about responsibility and stewardship. When leadership becomes centered on personal success, recognition, or control, it drifts away from its true function. Power may increase, authority may expand, but trust diminishes. Leadership that serves the self first inevitably narrows its vision because decisions become filtered through ego rather than purpose. Service shifts that lens outward, anchoring leadership in contribution rather than consumption. Human beings are wired to respond to leaders who demonstrate that the mission matters more than their personal advancement. When leaders place themselves above the cause, people feel used rather than valued. They comply, but they do not commit. Service-oriented leadership reverses this dynamic by making it clear that authority exists to protect, support, and enable others. This creates loyalty that is voluntary rather than forced, and effort that is given rather than extracted. Service requires humility, but humility is often misunderstood. It is not self-doubt or passivity. It is clarity. It is the understanding that leadership is not about being the smartest voice in the room, but about creating an environment where the best ideas can surface. Leaders who serve something bigger than themselves listen more than they speak. They ask better questions. They recognize that their role is not to have all the answers, but to create conditions where answers can emerge collectively. When leadership is grounded in service, decision-making changes. Short-term wins become less attractive if they undermine long-term trust. Choices are evaluated not only by immediate outcomes, but by their impact on people, culture, and future stability. This naturally encourages ethical behavior, because serving a larger purpose makes it harder to justify actions that harm others for personal or organizational gain. Integrity becomes operational rather than aspirational. Service-centered leadership also reshapes how success is defined. Instead of measuring success solely by growth, profit, or dominance, leaders begin to measure it by sustainability, resilience, and human development. They ask whether people are stronger, more capable, and more confident because of the system they lead. This perspective transforms leadership from a race into a responsibility where progress is measured by collective advancement rather than individual achievement. In organizations, leadership as service creates cultures of trust. When people believe leaders are acting in the best interest of the mission and the team, fear recedes. Psychological safety increases. Individuals are more willing to take risks, admit mistakes, and challenge assumptions. Innovation thrives not because it is demanded, but because it feels safe to explore. Performance improves as a byproduct of belief rather than pressure. Self-serving leadership, by contrast, creates fragility. Systems become dependent on personalities instead of principles. Decisions are centralized, succession is neglected, and dissent is discouraged. When such leaders leave, organizations struggle because the purpose was never embedded beyond the individual. Service-oriented leaders avoid this trap by building structures, values, and people that can outlast them. Their goal is continuity, not dependency. Leadership as service also extends beyond organizations into society. Communities and institutions function effectively only when leaders are perceived as caretakers of the common good. When leadership is viewed as a path to personal enrichment, public trust collapses, cooperation declines. Rules multiply to compensate for the absence of belief. Service restores legitimacy by aligning leadership with shared values and collective well-being. Serving something bigger than oneself requires courage. It often means making unpopular decisions, resisting short-term incentives, and accepting personal cost for collective benefit. It requires leaders to absorb pressure rather than pass it down. This form of leadership is demanding, but it is also deeply meaningful because it connects effort to impact beyond the self. Leadership rooted in service also changes how power is used. Power becomes a tool to remove obstacles, not to assert dominance. Authority is exercised to protect the vulnerable, clarify direction, and uphold standards. This creates environments where people feel empowered rather than controlled, trusted rather than monitored. True leadership is not defined by visibility or influence, but by responsibility willingly carried in service of a cause, community, or a future that extends beyond personal success. So if success without meaning is still failure, then the responsibility before us is clear. We must stop asking only how fast we are growing and start asking why we are moving at all. We must stop rewarding leaders who extract results at the expense of people and start supporting those who build trust, safety, and belief. Each of us, regardless of title or position, has a choice to make every day, to work for applause or for impact, to lead with fear or with service, to chase short-term wins or to commit to something that will matter long after we are gone. When we rediscover our why, when we choose empathy over ego and purpose over pressure, we do more than improve performance. We restore dignity, connection, and hope. The future will not be built by the most powerful or the most efficient, but by those willing to serve something bigger than themselves and invite others to do the same.